Good morning. Welcome to our monthly IHE Third Thursday Lunch and Learn. I welcome Amanda Friedeman, who is my colleague at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, and we have the honor of working together in the Czech program, which is for like organizations, and we worked on some education programs together. And last year, she mentioned at a program we were at about a new graphic novel that the museum was just introducing, and I said this would make a wonderful lunch and learn. So I asked her if she would present, and let me just give you a little bio, and then I'll turn it over to you. Uh, she is the Associate Director of Education at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, overseeing field trip content, professional development offerings for educators, the Museum Speakers Bureau, and docent training. She engages with history through innovative tellings of survivor stories, including second and third generation narratives, interactive video, immersive video reality, the new program that's amazing. Most recently, she co-edited Interrupted Lives, 9 Stories of Child Survivors of the Holocaust, which is going to be published this coming March. She holds a BA in History of Art from Princeton University and an MA in Art Education from the School of Art Institute of Chicago, with an emphasis in museum and community-based programs, into interdisciplinary curricula and media literacy. And so I welcome her, and she is going to talk to us today about the new graphic novel, Hour of Need, the daring escape of the Danish Jews during World War II. I think it's an amazing new resource. We're looking forward to actually presenting it as one of the gifts that we present to teachers this year. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to go on mute.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be with you today. It is snowing pretty hard in Chicago right now, so I hope you're having a lovelier day than we are there in Omaha. As Scott said, I'm with the Illinois Holocaust Museum. And before I dive in to our core content today, just a little bit of background. About 6.5 years ago, our museum was approached by a local second generation, the son of a Danish Holocaust survivor, who wanted to tell his mother's story and had the idea to tell it as a graphic novel. He had never written a book before. He had never written a graphic novel, but he came to us with a script. None of the illustrations, but the text of what this story would be. And since on our staff, I tend to be the one who works with the younger end of our student age spectrum. Our leadership team came to me and said, "Hey, graphic novels are for kids. What do you think?" And I read through the script and I was absolutely blown away. The potential of this story, the way that it was crafted, the framing of it was all really amazing. And so Ralph Shane, this author, and I spent the next 6 years working on this book together, securing an illustrator, securing an agent, and we were thrilled and honored to not only get the book published by an actual publisher, as opposed to the many stories that are wonderful but are self-published and therefore don't get the exposure and the reach that they might deserve. And we were able to release and publish the book in time for the 80th anniversary of the events in the book, which was last September, October. And so now the book has been out in the world for about a year, and the fact that the interest in this story is ongoing is really inspiring and amazing. And I am excited to share it with all of you. And Scott, I am thrilled that you'll be using it with your teachers. Thank you. So to get us started, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully that will work. Can everybody see my stuff? Great. So in order to talk about the Holocaust in Denmark and the incredible events that happened in the fall of 1943, first we need to talk about Denmark. Denmark is a tiny little country that you can barely find when you look at a world map. And we find, especially when we work with students, no idea of the geography, no idea where Denmark is. So I will give you a hint. It's right there. It's the little teeny peninsula sticking up off the northern coast of Germany. And that is going to be really important in helping to facilitate the events that we'll be discussing. If we look in a little bit more closely, you see Denmark is in fact primarily in terms of land area, a peninsula coming off of Germany, but there are also many, many, many islands. The vast majority of the population is centered around the capital of Copenhagen and located very, very close, just across a narrow strait from Sweden. And that also is a critical feature in the events that we will be discussing. And so most of what we'll be talking about today are things that happened within this relatively small geographic area. To understand this story and to understand what happened to the Jewish community during the Holocaust in Denmark, we need to first talk about the Jewish community before the war. Who were the people who lived in Denmark? What did the Jewish community look like? It was an extremely long-standing Jewish community. The first Jewish inhabitants of what we now know as the country of Denmark were invited into the country by the king in 1622. So by the 1940s, they had been part of the Danish community for over 300 years. In 1814, Jewish Danes were granted full citizenship, full emancipation rights, so they were able to vote. They had all of the rights and responsibilities of any other Dane, regardless of religion. And shortly after that, in 1833, the Great Synagogue of Copenhagen was built, and that's what we're looking at on the screen, the exterior and then an interior view of the sanctuary. And it's, I think, important to note and slightly ironic that that date means that the synagogue celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1933, when just across the border, Germany was coming under the rule of the Nazis and the persecution of the Jewish community there had begun. The Jewish community in Denmark was extremely assimilated. They were one of the most highly assimilated Jewish communities in Europe. And between 1933, when the Nazis came to power in Germany, and the beginning of 1940, about 4,500 German and Eastern European Jewish refugees not only were accepted into Denmark, but were actively welcomed and encouraged to come into the country. Of those, about 3,000 came into the country to receive agricultural training before immigrating to what was at the time British Mandate Palestine. And so there was an openness, but there also was a kind of temporary nature to the majority of this refugee Jewish community. But about 1,500 of them, about a third of those refugees, did stay in Denmark. So by 1940, the Jewish population of the country was between 7,500 and 8,000 people. This represented about 0.2% of the total Danish population of around 4 million. So this was a tiny, tiny minority within the country. It was a larger percentage than the Jewish population in Germany, but it was still a very, very small minority of the overall population. And so of those 8,000, again, about 1,500 were the German and Eastern European refugees who I just mentioned, and about 6,000 were Danish citizens who had been in the country already. And the vast majority of the Jewish population lived in the capital of Copenhagen. There were a few hundred Danish Jews who lived in other cities and other areas, but the vast majority was concentrated in Copenhagen. and in relatively close proximity to the Great Synagogue. Life for all of Denmark, but especially for the Jewish community, changed on April 9th, 1940, when, as part of its invasion and expansion of Western Europe, Germany invaded Denmark. This was absolutely shocking to the Danes. They had remained neutral in World War I and fully expected to do so again and to be left to their own devices. Instead, Germany conquered their next door neighbor, not through an assault, not through a direct attack, the way that Germany had invaded Poland or France or the Netherlands, but instead by sending what the Germans referred to as friendly planes into Denmark. You can see on the left a photo from April 9th, 1940, of German warplanes flying over Amalienborg Castle, which was the home of the Danish king. And instead of dropping bombs, the planes were dropping leaflets to tell the Danish people that their German saviors had arrived and that they were to be welcomed into the Reich. This, I think, the Germans thought would be a welcome gesture and that the Danes would be excited to join them. That was not the case. The Danes were embarrassed and insulted by this and had no intention. They were very proud of their own heritage and their own cultural identity and had no intention of willingly joining and becoming part of Germany. On the right, you see the same scene, but as illustrated in the graphic novel. So just to give you a sense of how that was conveyed. The occupation of Denmark looked very different from the way the occupation played out in other countries. We know, for example, in Poland, the Nazi occupation was violent and brutal. And in other Western European countries, it took different forms, but generally was very directed, very deliberate, and oppressive. In Denmark, the occupation was comparatively extremely mild. It was again, this term that the Nazis used, it was a friendly occupation in a sense. The top leadership of the Danish government, which was a constitutional monarchy, fled to London and set up a government in exile. But there were two important additional elements to the functioning of the Danish government. One was that King Christian X stayed in Copenhagen, continued living in the Amalienborg Castle. He did not abandon his people. And the Danish government bureaucracy, not the top leadership, but all of the actual functioning elements of the Danish government remained in place and were allowed to continue operating with a degree of oversight from the Germans. This was important because, among other things, the Danish court system for criminal proceedings and the Danish police continued to operate and continued to maintain their own authority under the occupation. This was unheard of in other countries, even when there was the local authorities able to continue operating, they were very directly controlled, whereas in Denmark, they were given extreme latitude. Before we move on, I want to just address one aspect of King Christian's story. He had been on the throne of Denmark by this point for over 30 years. He was absolutely beloved by the Danish people. He was in many ways a figurehead, but really was the symbol of the country. And he knew that by staying and by remaining visible to the Danish people, it would give them strength to resist and to wait out the occupation, which they all knew, but also just hoped would end with the defeat of the Nazis in the war and in due time. And to help to strengthen the resolve of the Danish people, King Christian every day would leave the castle grounds and ride around the city on his beloved horse. And you can see in the picture on the left, King Christian riding his horse with German occupying soldiers saluting him, showing him respect. That is not something that we would see in any other occupied country, and was a symbol of, and really is a demonstration of how differently the occupation played out in this country. There is a myth about King Christian, which is extremely persistent and extremely untrue. And I suspect you all know what I'm about to say. There are stories that you hear over and over of King Christian on these rides around, these horse rides around the city, wearing a yellow star, the symbol that the Nazis forced Jewish people to wear. That is completely untrue. It's a lovely story. And the idea of him showing solidarity for the Jewish community makes for a beautiful story, but it is absolutely untrue. And one of the ways you know it's untrue is that Danish Jews were never required to wear the yellow star. There would have been no reason for King Christian to show solidarity in that way because it was not a restriction that was imposed on the population in that country. So if you've heard it, if you hear someone repeat it, please feel free to tell them that that is not correct history, and let's not perpetuate that fairy tale. So let's take a minute. I've talked about some of the reasons and some of the ways that Denmark was different in terms of how it was occupied, but let's talk a little bit about why that was. One important reason that Denmark and Danes were treated differently was that the Germans considered Danes to be fellow Aryans, to be not quite as good in their racial hierarchy as actual Germans, but really to be the next best thing. And they actively, as I said, wanted the Danes to join them and to become part of the Reich. And so because of this, the Danish government was given full autonomy in domestic affairs. So within the country, the internal proceedings, the Danes were left alone to manage their own affairs. The Germans did not, at least initially, prioritize what they called the Jewish question. And so anti-Jewish policies, anti-Jewish laws, anti-Semitic laws were not enacted in Denmark. The Jewish population was treated exactly the same as the broader population within the country. That means that Jewish Danes were not required to register. They didn't have to give up their homes. They didn't have to give up their businesses or property. And as I said, they were never required to wear the yellow star or to be singled out in that way. Another important difference is that the Jewish community was so integrated and so assimilated that extended to the Jewish community being actively supported, not just tolerated, actively supported by the broader population. One, I think, really powerful example of that is that multiple times the local Danish police prevented arson attempts at the Copenhagen synagogue in 1941 and 1942. And they not only stopped the arson, they arrested the perpetrators. And the perpetrators were tried in Danish courts, overseen by Danish judges. That is something that is the exact opposite of how attempted arsons of synagogues were treated in every other Nazi-controlled country. In addition, religious services continued in the Great Synagogue throughout the occupation. And the Danes had a long tradition of constitutional monarchy. They loved their royal family, but they also loved their democracy. And they recognized that Nazism and the fascist government structure that came with them was a threat to both of those, that were really symbols of Denmark and were aspects of their society that Danes were extremely proud of. And so for all of these reasons, both the way the Nazis approached Denmark and the way the Danes viewed both themselves and the Nazis, we see a very different dynamic happening than we have elsewhere. Another aspect of this Danish pride is that there was, from the moment those planes started dropping leaflets over Copenhagen, there was resistance in Denmark. In the beginning, it was largely passive resistance, refusal to cooperate, kind of resistance happening on the sly. And over time, it escalated to sabotage, armed resistance, direct action against the Nazis. Another aspect of Danish culture that the Danes are rightfully incredibly proud of is their most famous export, which is the stories and the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen. For most non-Danes, the thing they know about Denmark is Hans Christian Andersen. And one of his stories is the tale of Holger Danske, who is the figure you see in the statue on the left. Holger Danske was a real historical figure. He was a Viking king of Denmark. And according to the legend, when he reached the end of his life, he didn't die. Instead, he retreated to the catacombs below Elsinore Castle. Yes, the same castle from Hamlet. And in the catacombs below the castle, the Viking king Holger Danske went to sleep. And periodically, he awakens from his slumber, checks in essentially on Denmark, and as long as Denmark is safe, he goes back to sleep. But when Denmark needs him, as the legend says, in Denmark's hour of need, Holger Danske will awaken and return and avenge and protect all of Denmark. This is a story that Danish children are taught from a very, very young age. It is a source of national and cultural pride in the country, and it was the name adopted by the largest group within the Danish resistance. This is, the Danish resistance is often understood or portrayed as one unified effort involving every Danish person. That's not quite accurate. There was a significant amount of resistance. There was a much higher degree of participation in different types of resistance efforts than we see in most other occupied countries. But the resistance was actually extremely and deliberately fragmented. There were many different small cells operating that didn't have direct interaction or direct coordination because it was too dangerous. If someone was captured and interrogated, they could give away the entire operation. And so the identities of different groups, the operations of different groups were not shared across these different groups because it was simply too dangerous. But Holger Danske was the largest of these resistance groups. It had at its peak about 350 members, and their specialty was in carrying out sabotage and in gathering intelligence. And they were also critical in organizing and carrying out the evacuations from um, from Denmark, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the gentleman that you see in the center of the screen is a man named Svend Otto Nielsen. He was a high school math teacher before the war. And during the occupation, he left his teaching position and became very immersed in Holger Danske and ultimately became one of the leaders of Holger Danske. And we'll talk more about him in a few minutes. The situation in Denmark was relatively stable for the first roughly 3.5 years of the occupation. It was comparatively mild, as I said, but as the occupation continued, the resistance started to escalate and become more, the actions taken against the Nazis became more direct, became more violent, became more disruptive. And so, understandably, the Nazi reaction and response to the resistance also began to escalate. And so, in the summer of 1940, relations between the German occupiers and the Danish authorities still within the country became increasingly strained. This was in part because the Allied forces were achieving victories in Italy and North Africa. And this proved that the German military was not all powerful, that defeat of Germany was possible. And that inspired the resistance to escalate their activities. As that resistance increased, it became not only, for example, slashing the tires of German supply trucks, but labor strikes by Danish workers and other types of sabotage of German activities and activities forced on Danes in support of the German war effort. On August 28th, the remaining Danish government within the country resigned rather than agree to a change in policy that the Germans enacted, which was that from that point forward, any Danes arrested and accused of sabotage would be tried in German military courts rather than in Danish civilian courts. Up to that point, as I said, the Danish legal system remained in place and Danes were tried by Danes. The Germans, in an attempt to crack down on the sabotage, made a shift, and the Danish government resigned rather than agree to that change. The next day, martial law was declared in the country, and so the occupation has now become much more like what we expect a Nazi occupation to be, and the Germans took direct control of both the Danish military and the Danish police. Again, up to this point, the Danish police operated autonomously and in the same manner that they had prior to the occupation. About a week later, 10 days later, on September 8th, SS General Werner Best proposed that the martial law be used as an excuse, used as cover for the deportation of Danish Jews. So Nazi Jewish policy had not been a factor in Denmark, and Best is proposing that this change, that they do actually enact the final solution in Denmark. And 9 days later, on September 17th, Hitler approved the plan. For reasons that have never been exactly determined and that historians still argue over, Hitler's approval of the plan led Werner Best to reconsider whether he wanted to actually deport all of Denmark's Jews. And Best informed Georg Duckwitz, who you see in the photo, who was a German naval attaché to Denmark of the plan to deport the Danish Jewish population. It's baffling that he would have done this, that Best, an SS general, so someone who is fully on board with the Nazi plan and Nazi policy would reveal this step. But Duckwitz shared the information with other German officials who he believed to be sympathetic, and they, in turn, Duckwitz and the others, in turn, warned non-Jewish Danes who they had contact with of the plan to carry out the deportations. And from there, word spread to the Danish Jewish community. And this is the only time that a Jewish population had advance notice of exactly when and how they would be deported. And because of that, the Danish Jewish community and the Danish resistance was able to formulate a plan and a strategy to help people to survive. As was Nazi tradition, was something that happened frequently throughout the Holocaust. The original deportation plan was scheduled specifically to tie to the Jewish holidays. And so the Nazi deportation of the Danish Jews was scheduled to begin on the second day of Rosh Hashanah in 1943, which meant that during Rosh Hashanah services in that year, the chief rabbi of Denmark was able to inform the congregation, which included members of nearly every Jewish family in Copenhagen, of the danger and to warn them that they should go into hiding and attempt to get out of the country. And so very quickly, people's plans came together, and the Danish Jewish population, for the most part, began making their way to the coast. And from there, Danish fishing boats ferried families across the strait to Sweden, which was a neutral country and which agreed to let the Danish Jewish population in. So when the roundups began on October 1st, 1943, the Germans began knocking on doors and arriving at Jewish homes and found almost no one. Nearly everyone had left. In addition, the Danish police, who accompanied the Germans carrying out the roundup, refused to cooperate. They denied Germans the right to enter Jewish homes by force. If a Danish police officer stumbled upon a Jewish person attempting to hide, they didn't reveal that person's location. There were popular protests by the non-Jewish community throughout, particularly in Copenhagen again, but throughout the country. Church congregations staged protests. The Danish royal family officially protested. Social and economic welfare organizations all came together to protest rather than participate in these roundups. And as a result, over the next month, about 7,200 Danish Jews and 700 of their non-Jewish family members were able to be transported to safety in neutral Sweden. Remember, the Jewish population was about 8,000. So we're looking at 90% of the Danish Jewish population was able to get out of Denmark rather than be deported. This evacuation effort was happening on a massive scale, but it was happening in primarily small fishing boats, small private vessels. On the left, you can see the only known photo of Danish Jews on a fishing boat in the act of being evacuated. There are other photos of boats. This is the only one that was the only photo that we know of that was actually taken en route. This is a very, very well-known photograph in Denmark. It was actually made into a postage stamp in Denmark. And we'll talk about this more in a moment, but the gentleman down at, I don't know if you can see my pointer, down at the bottom of the frame wearing the hat is actually the grandfather of Ralph Shane, the author of the graphic novel that we'll be talking about in a moment. The evacuation effort was partially spontaneous and partially organized by different Danish resistance groups who reached out to fishermen who helped to coordinate both the transportation process and getting Jewish families to the shore, to harbors, to ports where they could leave from. In addition, some members of the Danish resistance were also transported to Sweden, and Swedish intelligence agents were transported back into Denmark to aid in the resistance on the ground there. So this is a massive undertaking. This is one of the truly great success stories of rescue and resistance in the Holocaust. So I want to pause. There's more to the story, but I want to pause for a moment and talk a little bit about the graphic novel. As I said, it is the story. It's called Hour of Need in reference to Holger Danske and a rising in Denmark's Hour of Need. And it tells the story of a 9-year-old girl named Meta. And you see her here. This image is the first page of the book. And it really gives you kind of the story in a nutshell. So we see Meta, we see King Christian on his horse, the occupation flag of the Nazis, Amalienborg Castle, and two of Hans Christian Andersen's most important fairy tales, Holger Danske and The Little Mermaid. And there's a statue in Copenhagen of the Little Mermaid looking out across the water, actually towards Sweden. And so she, in a sense, and in the minds of the Swedish people, or excuse me, the Danish people, was watching the boats carrying the Danish Jews to Sweden and was ensuring their safe passage. Meta, as I said, was just about her 9th birthday was just a few days after the attempted roundups began. And she had a very happy childhood in Copenhagen. As I said, her family was just like the other Jewish families, very, very assimilated. Meta actually didn't find out that she was Jewish until her father came home from Rosh Hashanah services with news of the roundup and had to explain to his daughter that she was Jewish so that she would understand why they had to leave. That is how assimilated and how secular the family was. And in the book, the story is told through a series of flashbacks. Meta, as a grandmother living in America, takes her grandchildren on a trip to Denmark to meet their Danish relatives, and while in Copenhagen with them, tells them for the first time her story. And so we see the story through Meta's eyes, but also through her grandchildren's eyes. She was shocked by the news that not only was she Jewish and had this identity she had been completely unaware of, but that her family would have to leave their home. As they made their way to the coast, Meta's family was actually aided and guided to a safe house where they could wait for a ship to take them by John, the resistance operative who I mentioned earlier. He was directly responsible for Meta's family's survival. As they crossed the water, most of the crossings happened at night for safety to make the boats less visible, but there were German Navy patrol ships searching for, they knew that the evacuations were happening and they were searching, hoping to intercept and capture the ships. However, in the case of the ship that Meta's family was on, and we know of a number of other cases, the ship was stopped by a German patrol. German naval officers boarded the ship, looked into the hold of the ship, which normally would be full of fish, and in this case was full of refugees, saw them, closed the ship, or closed the hatch, said nothing to see here, got back on their ship and left. And so, and this happened, there are many, many reports of things like this happening. The German Navy naval officers were not really invested in conquering the Danish people. The Germans liked the Danes. They liked Denmark. They didn't feel the need to oppress the people and were for the most part not as invested in pursuing the final solution as other elements of the Nazi infrastructure and the Nazi hierarchy were. So it's again another very different manifestation of a Holocaust story from what we're used to hearing. When Meta and her family arrived in Sweden, they arrived early in the morning. They had been traveling all night, and arrived and had the clothes on their backs, a couple of small suitcases, had nothing. And when they stood near the harbor, kind of trying to figure out where to go and what to do, Meta looked up and saw a young child with long blonde hair looking out the window and waving at her. She approached the building, and this child lowered a basket full of apples to her. And the family had the apples to eat and had kind of their first welcome to Sweden. And stories like this repeated all along the Swedish coast, where the Jewish refugees were welcomed and aided and helped to find housing, helped to find jobs and means of support. And ultimately, after the war, a significant number of the Danish Jewish refugees actually stayed in Sweden because they had been so welcome and had been able to build their lives. I included that scene of the apples from the illustration from the book, and alongside it, you can see a picture of Meta at age 9, shortly after she arrived in Sweden. And Ralph, the author, on a research trip to Denmark and to Sweden, attempted to find that child who had provided the apples. His mother had always described this child as a little girl with long blonde hair who helped them. And Ralph was able to determine that it was actually a little boy who just needed a haircut. But Ralph was actually able to meet him, and you can see him on the left. And he remembered the story, he remembered the family, and actually was similarly welcoming to a number of other families. His mother was quite upset with him for sharing what was supposed to be their store of apples to get them through the winter. He was giving out pretty generously throughout that October. But he is still alive and well and living in Sweden, and it was kind of a nice coda to that story. I do want to take a few minutes to talk about the rest of the Danish story, the survival, the escape, the rescue of these Jewish Danes is incredible and admirable and deserves to be celebrated. But there's another aspect to the Danish Jewish experience. About 500 Danish Jews, primarily those who lived far from Copenhagen, did not receive word of the roundups, did not know to leave their homes, to hide, to not open the door. And they were rounded up, and the Nazi plan was carried out on those Jewish people who were then deported to Theresienstadt, or also known as Terezin, the ghetto and transit camp outside of Prague. These Once in Theresienstadt, the Danish Jews continued to be treated differently than Jews from other countries. The Danish government continued to enact influence and to arrange preferential treatment, and the Danish Red Cross intervened, and so no Danish Jews were transported beyond Theresienstadt. The purpose of Theresienstadt was to hold people, and then before they were sent further east, usually to Auschwitz. No Danish Jews in Theresienstadt were deported beyond Theresienstadt. They remained there for the remainder of the war. That's not to say, and they were able to receive care packages and letters, and had unquestionably preferential treatment. It is not to say that they had it easy. About 50 Danish Jews died in Theresienstadt due to the conditions. One of the Danish Jews who did not evacuate, who was not able to leave, was a little boy named Steen Metz. And this is Steen before the invasion, before the war in Denmark started, enjoying an ice cream cone in the summertime. When the evacuations happened, Steen was 8 years old, and his family was living in the city of Odense, which is in Jutland. So it's a few hundred miles from Copenhagen, but it's on the peninsula rather than the island. And so it's, practically speaking, and especially in an era before the internet and easy electronic communication, it was incredibly far. And word of the roundups never made it to Odense in time for the Metz family to try to avoid the deportations. And so Steen and his parents were sent to Theresienstadt. Within the first 6 months, Steen's father had died of starvation. He was just not able to withstand the conditions. Steen and his mother were able to survive. Steen actually tells a story of he remembers playing soccer with the other children who were in the camp, but he knew that he would make friends. They would play soccer, they would have fun, and then his friends would disappear, and then new kids would arrive, and he would make friends with them. And there was this constant turnover. And at the time, he was a kid. He didn't understand what was going on. And years later, he finally asked his mother about it. And that was when she explained to him that his friends were disappearing because they were being deported and they were being sent to Auschwitz and murdered. And so it was, and he was, even though he was in the camp, he was kind of insulated from that because of his Danish identity. Steen and his mother and the other Danish Jews were evacuated from Theresienstadt a few days ahead of the liberation of the camp by the Red Army. They were transported in Red Cross buses back to neutral Sweden before being returned to Denmark. Steen and his mother stayed in Denmark. He grew up there, finished his education. In the early 60s, moved to Canada, and eventually came to the Chicago area, and is a member of the Speakers Bureau at the Illinois Holocaust Museum. And I just exchanged emails with him this morning, and he's still very active, telling this extremely unknown and undertold aspect of the larger history. When Steen returned to Denmark and when Meta's family returned to Denmark, they were actively welcomed by their neighbors. This is another way that Denmark was very different from what we saw in other countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, where returning Jewish survivors were persecuted, had their belongings stolen, were treated poorly by their neighbors. In Denmark, we hear story after story after story of the evacuees' non-Jewish neighbors not only not stealing from them, but actively caring for their homes and their possessions until they were able to return. I've even heard stories of people who returned to find that their neighbors had continued to dust their living rooms and water their plants. So this was this idea of the broader community not just accepting but embracing the Danish Jewish community even continued in the physical absence of the Danish community. And so this is the scene again from the book of Meta's return, and she discovered as she saw other returning classmates and friends that not only had she not known she was Jewish, there were many of her friends who were also Jewish, and she had never realized because it wasn't an aspect of their identity that they had talked about. Just to wrap things up, I want to talk just a little bit more about John and the resistance and Holger Danske in particular. After the Jewish community was safely evacuated, or the majority of the Jewish community was safely evacuated to Sweden, the resistance in Denmark continued operating and escalated their operations even more against the occupying Germans. John, the alias for school teacher Svend Otto Nielsen, remained a leader in Holger Danske until he was denounced by a Norwegian Gestapo informer named Hedvig Delbo. She was paid 20,000 Danish kroner for revealing John's whereabouts in December of 1943. He was followed by the Gestapo. He and another colleague in the resistance, who went by the codename Finn. John and Finn exchanged gunfire with a group of Gestapo agents. Finn was able to escape, but John was shot in the thigh, shattering his femur, shot 7 or 8 times in the abdomen. He was able to return fire, killed several of the Gestapo agents, but he was ultimately captured and arrested. He was thrown into a Gestapo prison and left there. No medical intervention, no assistance. He couldn't stand because of his leg, so he had to rely on his cellmates to help him to the latrine, to get his food from near the door, to bring it to him. It was absolutely the lack of attention that he received was actually a form of torture. And additionally, he was interrogated and tortured in that process. Unbelievably, he actually was able to survive until April of 1944, when he was tried in a German military court for the murder of the Gestapo agents. He was convicted and was executed a few days later at a place called Reivangen, which was the execution site that the Gestapo used for Danish resistors, and there was a small graveyard there, and so Danish resistors were executed and buried at Reivangen. That place is now known as Reivangen Memorial Park, which you see on the screen. This is an image of Queen Margareta II laying a wreath at the memorial in honor of the Danish resistance. In all, of the roughly 350 members of Holger Danske, 35 were killed during the war, either in the course of their resistance activities or were executed by the Nazis for their activities. So the Danish resistance was incredibly effective, incredibly honorable, but it was an extremely dangerous undertaking, and the Danish and the members, paid a pretty significant price for their activities. But they continue to be honored, and there are formal public memorials and recognition and honoring of the resistors, both those who survived and those who did not in Denmark. And it's an aspect of their history of which they are rightfully quite proud. So I want to just note before, and then I'm happy to answer questions, anything you'd like to talk about, but I want to just reach behind me for a moment. And we have, as I said, a wonderful graphic novel telling this story. And we were incredibly fortunate to be able to translate it into Danish. So there is a Danish edition, which won in January of this year, won the Klaus Delurian Award, which is the prize given to the graphic novel of the year in Denmark. The Danish comics industry is a behemoth. Graphic novels are an incredibly popular and important art form in Denmark, in a way, an important form of storytelling. And we were extremely honored that they chose this story as the graphic novel of the year for 2023. And I'm pretty excited that I have a graphic novel in Danish, sitting in my stash. So that is it. That is the story of Denmark and Hour of Need. And if anybody has questions, I would love to answer them and to chat with you.
Well, I will start with the first question. First of all, thank you very much. That was absolutely wonderful, fascinating. A lot of information and a lot of clarification, which I personally greatly appreciate. How's the novel been received?
It has been terrific. We are really pleased with the response. It's selling quite well, which is great. We do carry it in our museum bookshop, and we'd be happy to ship you a copy. And it is being used in schools around the country. I've done workshops for teachers about how to work with this book in Illinois, in Houston, Texas, and in just a few weeks, I'll be doing a workshop for teachers in South Florida. And then coming up at the beginning of 2025, I'll be working with teachers in the Detroit area and throughout the state of New Jersey. So it's really getting out there. And we have on the Illinois Holocaust Museum website, we have a teaching guide for the book. We also have a teaching trunk, which is literally a physical steamer trunk filled with the resource guide, an additional teaching guide to supplement that, 30 copies of Hour of Need for teachers to use with their class, and then additional resources on teaching the larger story of Denmark and the Holocaust, and teaching particularly the aspect of the Danish story of those who were deported to Theresienstadt. And so that is free. We will ship it to any school in the United States for a 4-week loan. So if schools, we know actually buying books for the classroom can be difficult with school budgets, but we are happy to, we have several of the teaching trunks, and we are happy to ship them to any school in the country to use.
Wonderful. We have a question about, are there other books or materials on the Danish rescue that you would recommend for just enriching our knowledge on the topic?
There are not as many books on Denmark as I think there should be. um, it's still kind of an undertold story. The sort of the most famous is Lois Lowry's book for children called Number the Stars, which is not going to give you a comprehensive history, but is a nice introduction to it. I think actually the best books are written in Danish and haven't been translated. That's a big part of the problem, is this is a story that is not largely told outside of Denmark. But actually, there is a relatively new museum to the Danish resistance in Copenhagen that is part of the Danish National Museum system. And their website is actually very well done and very comprehensive and tells the story of the resistance through 5 specific resistors, through 5 personal stories. And that's actually a great place to start, I think. And then through that museum, they have a bibliography and they have additional resources. But the Danish Resistance Museum website is the place I would start.
Right. Gary, you had a question?
Yeah, I was reading, before you started, I was reading the Danish schools just started, I guess what they would call mandatory Holocaust education this past year. Is this the result of that? And I guess more to the point, given the controversial year that we're still going through, how has Holocaust education been accepted in Denmark?
I'm not an expert in the Danish education system, so take my answers for what they're worth. There has been I do know that just from talking with colleagues in Denmark in connection with the development of this book project, there has been an effort in recent years in Denmark to more comprehensively tell their own story and to teach this history. In the years following the Holocaust, the Danish Jewish survivors didn't really talk about it because they were very, very aware of how different their story was from other survivors and how comparatively mild their experience and their suffering was. They had enormous upheaval, their lives were thrown through for a loop, but they didn't suffer in the way that other communities did. And so they, for a long time, felt that they didn't really have the right, if you will, to tell their stories and that their stories weren't important. And so it was very much not talked about. And in more recent years, there has been a shift and an understanding that these stories they are different from the stories we might hear coming out of other countries or other populations, but there is still value in them for teaching us both a framing of the larger history and how this fits within that story, but also teaching us completely different lessons, teaching us about the effectiveness of resistance, the importance of standing up for our neighbors and treating them as fellow human beings. And that is and that's an aspect that Holocaust education around the United States has really embraced, and it's something that Denmark has been making strides to get their survivor generation, both Holocaust survivor and resistance survivor generation, to be more willing and comfortable to share their stories. And so that's why one of the reasons that this resistance museum I mentioned is relatively new. You would think that that would be something that they would have wanted to be celebrating, and it was actually something they were a little bit hesitant to put out and to really talk about.
Yeah, I guess the other reason that I wanted to ask the question has to do with the fact that so much of the world has made a sharp turn to the right with governments, including our own, and that Holocaust education actually, that the events that led to the Holocaust are very much part of our modern world, no matter where we are now.
Well,
And I think that
the events aren't the same.
not the
We don't
events,
live in, we fortunately don't live in the 1930s, but the lessons of the Holocaust can always be applied to the world we live in, and that is absolutely true today.
I guess I was speaking about hate speech and
Yeah.
which is at an all-time level, certainly in my life, and certainly in the lives of people that I know that are in other countries. So the events that led to the Holocaust start with words, start
Mhm.
with hatred, start with how people are treated, and that is very much part of our world.
Absolutely.
And that also is actually a part of, I mean, man and I both can say that, and Jane, within the programs that we run, that's something that is one of the first things we talk about, is that it begins with the words and begins with the speech. And if anything, it just makes our work even more important today. And
Absolutely.
and we're dedicated to doing it. We have time for one more question if we have one.
I know it was very important for the Germans to be in Denmark for the control of the waterways.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was, yeah, strategically, it was an important position for the Navy, definitely.
Go
Yes, I just wanted to ask what age the graphic novel was appropriate for.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Given the subject matter, we recommend it for generally 6th grade and up. An advanced 5th grader could probably handle it. But it's, it is dealing with the Holocaust, and it's not as graphic as other Holocaust survivor stories, but there is historical context to it that the child needs to understand. So generally, we recommend it for 6th grade and up, but we absolutely recommend it for adults too.
Mhm.
And we will be ordering some, actually, like I said, we're going to be giving it to some teachers we're working with, and we'll have a couple extra in our office if anybody would like to stop by to see it. Amanda, thank you so much. That was absolutely great. And
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me. You might have noticed I love talking about Denmark, and so
it's great. Yeah.
this was really fun.
There's actually a Nebraska connection. We had a school here, I think it was Blair College, and in the late 80s, they honored the Melchior family, and Rabbi Melchior's son, also Rabbi Melchior, who was here. And actually, I was working at the day school here at that time, Dana College, excuse me. Thank you very much, Steve. And visited, and it was a highlight in the community back in the late 80s.
And I realized I didn't actually use his name. Rabbi Melchior was the chief rabbi
Yeah.
in Copenhagen
And
during.
his son went
he
on
was
to
the one announcing the intended deportations from the pulpit on Rosh Hashanah. So yeah, quite a guy.
Great. Well, thank you again. All the best for a wonderful Thanksgiving. And for the rest of us, I look forward to seeing you next month. We'll be looking at a personal story about Courtroom 600, where the Nuremberg trials took place, with a woman named Lori. Excuse me, I don't remember her last name right off the hand. I'm sorry. But we'll be presenting on her father's story. He was a guard, like our own Roy Long, at the Nuremberg trials. So I thank you all. There'll be information out on that. There's an article in this week's Jewish Press about it. And I look forward to seeing you all next month, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving. And great to see you all. Amanda, again, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everybody.